Thank you. Welcome everybody on November 6, 2022, another Global Technopolitics Forums meeting. And yeah, it's a small meeting. And I think we start the day with the new paper we have. I hope you guys had a chance to look at it. Firza John, could you take a few minutes, like 5 minutes, and talk about your paper?
Yes, sorry for the delay in finalizing it. I was traveling about 2.5 months somewhere. I'm about to go away again to Asia. And I found, as you guys had requested more on diaspora and civil society, I found that a little bit of a challenge to address this issue in sub-Saharan Africa, even though I purposely left out South Africa in much of this because they're an outlier. But it was difficult. So because there are so many variations, Nigeria, especially Kenya is at the forefront. I mean, you can't compare something like a place like Kenya with Central African Republic, for instance. That's just, they're at the very, very beginning stages. So I tried different ways of approaching this and then opted to go for actually looking at particular examples and then trying to draw conclusions from that and see what the common themes and threads are. And then the diaspora as well. I'm especially these days when I'm looking at the Iranian diaspora and how they have kind of connected up and what they're doing. And I compare that with the African diaspora. There is really like an unevenness. It's a much more, some countries are much more politicized, like Iran is and people in the Middle East are, and in Africa, not so much. And if you noticed also in my paper, Afrobarometer, says that even young people, you would think that a country that is so young that they would be at the forefront of driving democracy. And in certain cases they are, but then also Afrobarometer has noticed that there is like less interest in political organizing among the youth, which is not a good sign. Anyway, the focus of this paper was initially uniquely to see what the impact of the digital revolution is in Africa and particularly on elections and democracy. So that was like kind of like a smaller focus. And then as I wrote and as we talked, it kind of expanded more to be about democracy. So we were doing nothing having to do with the digital, and I tried to just keep it focused because otherwise you are looking at a huge continent with many different variables, and you're like, the minute you chase one variable, you're missing out on something else. So that was part of the challenge of doing this, even though it was a very interesting paper for me, and I'm connected very much to this country. The pictures that you saw in the paper, they're all mine. I've taken them in different elections and different situations in Africa, so you can freely use them. So I have been like very close to some of these processes and find it interesting. So in terms of social media, of the digital revolution and the digital penetration in Africa, I find there are a lot of benefits in terms of functionality, in terms of, especially in the financial sector, when you see remittances, when you see these financial platforms. But in terms of democracy, I particularly don't have a great take on it. I mean, even like coming out of Africa, looking at the world and what's happening. I mean, I'm glad Lula won, but it hasn't done a lot of good, even in mature democracies. And so then I tried to kind of highlight some of the particularities of Africa that present obstacles and challenges to that. The thousands of ethnicities, the fairly recent nation building projects, the many languages, the population density, Nigeria aside, but there are many places in Africa where it's like still very rural, and there's even the hinterlands are not connected to the capital, and so and then the resources that they have, and they come from an history of big man rule and authoritarian regimes and coups d'etats, and colonial legacies, and so when you have a situation where you have these mineral resources, it creates rentier economies, and that just by virtue of what it is, it connects the elite more to the people who are in search of those minerals rather than their own people, and so that is a huge imbalance. And now we see the three main powers kind of like taking their competitions and their fights to the continent. They're fighting each other and they're competing for resources. Russia is going for the lowest hanging fruit, dissemination of disinformation and their trolls and their mercenary activities in service to dictators and authoritarian regimes, and the war on terror is still, going on across the Sahel, which is actually interrupting democratic revolutions and democratic evolutions. And so these things, all of these elements, for me, they didn't present an optimistic outlook. But then I tried to kind of end the paper on a sort of an optimistic, hopeful note, to kind of say that, well, it's a very young continent, median age around 20, and big population growth. And then maybe the empowerment will come through the financial sector, for the empowerment that as the middle class will grow and as they become more educated, nation building, democratization, civic life, civic space, political activity, all those things maybe will come as a result of that. And then I also tried to bring in like little anecdotal realities about that continent that make it magical to me. I mean, it's hard. I was trying to talk about Africa in terms of, the magic, its magical side. I mean, to see after like many years of civil war in Liberia, these women sat outside the event when people, they were at 10 months, they couldn't come up to a peace agreement, and they linked arms and said nobody's allowed to leave until you reach a peace agreement. And they tried to clear them out. The military came to clear them out, and then they said that if you even touch us, we are going to strip naked. And the military actually ran away because they were scared of seeing their nice little taboo in their country. I mean, there are so many interesting little magical things that are specific to Africa. And I know of other civic action in Liberia. They refused sex with their men, with their husbands. So until, they stopped fighting, until, this. So then there are these other anecdotal elements that I tried to draw on. But I tried to kind of highlight many different aspects in terms of history and culture and big power play. I didn't even go into Turkey or UAE, Saudi Arabia, whatever. But each person, I mean, when you have a continent that's kind of free for all, and it's easy to make money, and there's no accountability, you're going to have all kinds of profiteering, exploitative elements that come to it. So I hope that the the paper will, you know, kind of like present the picture that I intended to convey.
Thank you very much. It was very, very difficult. I know it took a while, and it was very, very difficult and complex to cover that.
But it was fun. So it was. I enjoyed it. Even though it took me longer. Next time, give me a deadline.
Yes, I should give myself deadline. So, Greg, any comment?
Oh, unfortunately, I haven't gotten to it yet. You make me, Thursday, make me want to read it. So that sounds great. I will look forward to it. Forgive me.
And Greg, if you please write forwards for it,
okay.
I
Yes.
appreciate it.
It will do.
Yeah, Paul, any comment?
Yeah, well, maybe a few. I mean, I read through it, but admittedly, not in as great as much detail as I would have wanted to. It covers a lot of ground, which is great. I mean, I think, you know, it's a really good, thorough description of some of those themes.
Yeah.
Photos that you talked about. Clearly, that a lot of effort went into it, which is great. And I can't say that I'm such an expert on Africa, so it was really, some of the things in there were really quite interesting. You know, some new insights. I guess my thought would be, just because it covers so much ground, number one would be, what should someone reading it focus on? Like, what would be, of all those things, a priority to focus on? And sort of as a corollary to that, you know, in the introduction, you mentioned about this issue of young people in Africa not being as politically active, it sounded like, as maybe young people in other places. Sort of, you know, you were comparing with Iran. I guess probably there are other countries you could compare with as well. So the question in my mind would be, why? Like, why aren't they as politically active? And that may be an interesting angle to take in thinking about focusing the paper. The third question or thought that I had was this whole idea of democracy and the path to democracy. And you know, just now you were sketching out this sort of progression where people rise to the middle class, they get wealthier, and the whole society somehow becomes a democratic society. So I guess my question would be, you know, it seems like the idea of what a democracy is and what we mean by democratic is going through a huge transformation at the moment. Number two, we can see plenty of cases around the world. I take China as the most immediate example of where that progression doesn't seem to actually have taken hold. So, you know, once again, maybe there's a changing definition of democracy, but I'd sort of be hard put to classify China as a democracy. And yet it has, in a lot of ways, gotten into the, you know, middle class people have gotten wealthier, but they haven't necessarily gone towards a democratic system, at least as we would understand, say, in the United States or in the EU. So is that necessarily a foregone conclusion, or some way that Africa, especially given its history and background, as you know, really sketched out really well, can we imagine that that would actually be their trajectory? Or is there another trajectory that we can't, you know, at this point imagine, a different political model that might emerge? And I say different political model, as you point out in the paper, there's so many different factors and parameters that have to be taken into account when you're considering a whole continent like that, even just one country. That seems to me quite a big challenge. Anyway, just a few reflections in what I admit is not as deep a reading as I would have liked to have given it. So I apologize for that.
Yeah, the timing. Sorry. Go
I'm sorry. I love that you asked that question, Paul, because that is in itself, I think it's a very interesting conversation. Whether democracy, as we think of it, is that going future even a viable way to think of governance, or does it have, I mean, considering what's happening in China, considering the rise of surveillance states, considering the nexus of power between big tech and authoritarian states, is it even fathomable to think that that democracy has a future, or has its heyday. Then, as long as governments can provide a good life for their people, which, I mean, to your point, China, the rising middle class, they have, you know, most things that they need, and you don't really have this agitation for democracy. Maybe if you get to a point where you have that piece of pie that you need in order to have a good life, then maybe that's what it is. In a political freedom, you don't really need. I don't know, but these are very good questions, and I welcome actually a whole debate on that. It doesn't have anything to do with digital, but I find myself thinking about it, looking at Iran, looking at all the Middle East. I mean, Egypt, the US. I mean, to think that Lula lost by just like 1 or 2 points, that's amazing. That is incredible. So that's a good question, which I don't have an answer to, but I find myself thinking about a lot.
Mm-hmm. And I want to add something. We often say that the future of democracy is very grim, but looking at what is happening around the world, increasingly, I feel that a lot of upheavals, people from different perspectives, I don't think the love for democracy has gone down. It's the way to approach it. It's the institution, it's the practices, it's the understanding of it differs between people. And from some point of view, the other point is, you know, against democracy, where from their own point of view, they are actually fighting for democracy. So I think there's a lot of changes in terms of understanding it. And also there is tension currently in the world that a lot of people also put it down to the way that political system is working, which is perhaps it's not necessarily the political system, but we are in transitional time. We're moving from one world view, one ways of reflecting to another one. And it creates a lot of anxiety, and those uncertainties creates, you know, a lot of grievances that people express it in different ways. So I'm not sure everything. I don't think democracy is in crisis, actually. I think we're going through a transitional period that as a result, we're revisiting the principles and meanings of a lot of fundamental, you know, themes. Greg?
Yeah, I always remind myself that we tend to think of liberal and democracy as joined, right? But that's only because that's a reflection of European experience, where European states were liberal in the sense of having some individual rights and freedoms before they were democracies. But democracy only means majority rules. And so we can have mobocracy, we can have illiberal democracies. We have those growing up in many places. And so I have to keep reminding myself that we conjoin liberal and democratic, but in fact, that's only a reflection of European experience and not necessarily a good guide to thinking about other places.
I think also that concept that you introduced, where the majority rules, I think that's actually questionable. Is democracy really the rule of majority? Majority is going to win anyway. So we don't need democracy to help majority to win. I think democracy to me is to the degree they observe minorities' rights. So that's kind of thinking about values, how we approach it, and then how, what kind of institutions going to ensure what we are, the principles that we inject into it. I want to also ask George. George, what is your take on the whole thing? Did you have a chance to look at the paper, or it's arrived too late? You did? Thank you.
Yeah, I really like the section like China's presence in Africa, because that's kind of related to what I am working on right now. And a few examples, including how Huawei's penetration in those like telecommunication infrastructure market in Africa are quite helpful. And you mentioned that how China's like development bank and export and import bank help those kind of like so-called private company to gain the competitive advantage in the market is what I'm working on right now. Actually, I perhaps like digging more into that, like explaining how those banks gain enough fund to support those like infrastructure project overseas. And yeah, I think the part on China is really helpful to my work as well. So
Good, good. That's great.
I look forward to reading yours when you're done.
And
Yeah, just
Samuel? Yeah, sorry, Paul, go on.
no. I'll let Sam go first. Sorry, I already occupied enough time.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I didn't get a chance, unfortunately, to read it. I've been sick this past week, so I've been trying to get over that, but I will take a look at it. I apologize.
Not
Hope you
at
feel
all,
better.
sorry.
Feel better.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yes. So maybe, George, you want to talk a bit about your paper, how far you have gone, and what are you doing?
Mhm. Yeah, sure. So in the past few weeks, I've already summarized a few works I've done before and tried to like compose a relatively formal report based on those material I had before. And yeah, so the basic question my paper is trying to answer is that how like China's those like policy bank, including China Development Bank, support those like financially non-viable project in, for example, in Africa, but still like they are still pushing that project through a BRI fund and other like similar fund in Africa and in other emerging market. And I try to like discuss the financial structure of that and try to like compare with like counterparts of other countries such as the Development Bank of Japan and like try to compare their financial structure and how like China's like those policy bank gain a few advantage on that and why those like developing countries are eager to gain loan from China instead of other countries. And yeah, so try to like connect how technology related to overseas development finance. I include a few examples, as I mentioned before, such as Huawei's 5G infrastructure in Africa, how they're like allegedly use of like backdoor mechanism, and also a few example of unauthorized usage or access of data have caused concern among other countries. And yeah, in the next few weeks, I hope to like find more examples on that. And yeah, I think the Digital Africa's paper also like provide a lot of like, insight. For example, how I remember a few example on talking about like Addis Ababa.
Yeah,
how
exactly. I was
the
going to
data,
bring that up. Yeah.
yeah, right. How the data was
I
transferred
was like,
from
what?
like yeah, how the data was transferred to China, and a few other example like microphone were detected hidden in decks and walls. Yeah, so that's would be the direction I will work on in the next few weeks.
Do you have a deadline for yourself, George?
I hope to have a few specific example by the end of next like Friday or Saturday, talking about like how,
Thanks.
yeah.
That's very good.
Sounds
That's
good.
very good. Greg, any comment?
No, it sounds good. So I'll look forward to
Paul?
it.
Yeah, just a few thoughts. You know, and I saw this in Firuza's paper as well. This idea that China has extended all sorts of credit and loans to Chinese. I'm sorry, to African governments, to African enterprises as part of some of these infrastructure projects. I think over the last few years, there's been a rather significant change in that strategy and approach to something a little bit more conservative. And I think there have been a lot more, careful evaluation being done by CDB, for example, the Chinese Exim Bank, and there have been a lot of rather significant policy changes. The other thing is that I think if you look at Huawei, there too, their position has somewhat changed in the way they do business, but in Africa, in terms of what they're promoting, how they work with customers, and then they're not so eager as they once were to extend credit in support of the sales of their solutions and products as they once were. The other thing is Huawei, if you look at how they do business, not exclusively in Africa, but they tend to lower prices and be aggressive on pricing for hardware. But then when you look at the services part of the business, maintenance, for example, being a key component, then actually, and that's where margins are higher, that's usually where then the pricing schedule and the pricing structure is quite a bit different. So I think you have to make some distinctions, a little bit more fine distinctions between what Huawei is actually selling, what makes up their portfolio, and how willing they are at this point to extend credit and loans that previously at least supported a lot of their sales, or a lot of, I mean, some percentage of their sales.
Important point.
Thank you.
Yeah, I touched
But-
on the fact that they're pulling back a little bit, and also that they are getting pushback from Africans themselves, from
Mhm.
citizens to
Yeah,
like
I
what's
mean,
going on.
Yeah, China is not, so somehow protected from, or that they're also caught up in a lot of the, they become a political pawn in some of
Right.
the internal politics of some of these countries.
Mhm.
They're not above that, and they've gotten into some problems because of that. But I think if you look at studies, there've been a number of studies that have come out of Johns Hopkins. There's a center there that's been focusing on Chinese overseas financing, headed up by Professor Braudagam, who spent basically most of her career on the topic, and especially on China's involvement in Africa. But she concluded in this paper that came out about, I think, 2.5 years ago, that in fact China's financial profile and lending profile, at least from a government to government standpoint, was actually not much different than that of other countries who are active in the continent. So like India, for example, a couple of other examples that she provided. But once again, there too, you have to make a distinction between government to government, lending, and then commercial banks. They have a very different approach and profile. So anyway, I've probably gone into too much here, but just a couple of considerations maybe.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Important point.
Take the notes on that.
Greg, any comments? Any comments, Greg?
No, just those seem like important points. And it's my impression as well that those things have been happening over the last couple of years.
So, Samuel, would you like to give us some summary of what you have been doing? What is your research? How far have you gone?
Yes, of course. So in terms of research, Paul suggested that it'd be better, or it might be good to also look at sources beyond just that of like US academia and like the US approach to applying AI into military capabilities. And primarily, I think that would be especially reaching out and looking at literature that the Chinese have written, as well as kind of understand and recognize the types of approaches that they've been taking. And so in the past couple of weeks, a lot of it has just been research and kind of collecting some information on that. Another thing that I think has been something that's worth highlighting, especially in the paper too, is just the implication of AI being a dual use technology, and that heavily influencing the way different states would approach it. So I think the way I'm looking at it is that the approach that the American or the US does towards AI highlights like both the importance of civilian use as well as military use. But when you look at the state like China, it really is the state that's pushing a whole directive towards really revamping AI into every single facet of their civilian use, but also military power. And it's really state driven, as opposed to like relationships that are maintained for the US between the government and the innovative companies that work with AI. I know, for example, the Department of Defense has the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental, which really focuses on building a relationship with private companies. But in China, one of the books I was reading mentioned that their Sputnik moment meant that they launched like a national level AI innovation agenda for civil military fusion. So you see some slight differences, and I think it's going to be interesting trying to examine the differences between those two. In terms of actually putting in outlined work into more of a rough draft format, frankly, I haven't been able to do that just because this past week, as I mentioned, I've been ill, but also I was doing some interviewing. So I do have some catching up to do, but the weeks ahead are more free. So I do intend to put more work into that.
Sounds very good. Thank you very much, Samuel. Any comments, Greg?
No, it sounds
Anyone
good.
else?
Sounds good.
Paul, any comments?
No, none really. Well, Sam and I have had a number of discussions, both online, but also just by email, asynchronously there. And it looked to me like things are on the right track and making good progress. As I said, the only thing, once again, I would highlight or emphasize is, as you were saying, Sam, I think, the sort of perspective from the other side of the table. So, the studies, and once again, I haven't done any sort of exhaustive research on this at all, but I mean, if you look at the studies, they're always about what the US position is, or what the US and China's position is. But I think it's somewhat maybe an interesting angle and a little bit unique to sit there. And as I said to you, what is the defense minister of Vietnam like? What is he thinking? And certainly this is top of mind, right? Because they got China breathing down their necks and they've had plenty of conflicts. So he's definitely got his eye on something like this. And I think it's sort of a unique angle, not necessarily that would be the focus of the paper, but just to give it a little bit of a dimension that perhaps isn't so easily found elsewhere is, what does someone in Vietnam think about a topic like this? And how does that position Vietnam within this larger universe of China's and US and people like that? And maybe Vietnam is representative for a whole host of other countries that find themselves in a similar geopolitical position. So anyway, that was just a thought that I had of something that might be a little bit unique that the paper could integrate.
Right. Yes.
That's actually quite an interesting point.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, Greg, is there anything you want to report?
No.
Okay, and I have been busy. I will be traveling from tomorrow morning. I am busy with the topic of fragmentation, internet fragmentation and democracy. So that's a focus of my work, and I'm presenting few papers and moderating several panels on that topic. So I already have spoken about the topic. I think you all are familiar what fragmentation is and how it's impacting in terms of geopolitics, how it's impacting the geopolitics. So therefore, I'm not going to repeat it again. And on that note, if there is anything anyone wants to discuss, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just want to take an opportunity to thank Firuza again for sharing the paper. I mean, that was a hell of a lot of work. And
Yeah.
frankly, in my first read through it, there's a lot of things that I learned, that I had no idea about. So that always is the mark of a good paper. So I really appreciate the effort and sharing it and the perspective. It's really great.
Absolutely. No, it really is.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually, congratulations, Firuza, on that paper. Unfortunately, I haven't had time to look at it yet, but I'm looking forward to read through it, and and we will publish it, in a proper publication manner. So I know Firuza wanted to talk a bit about Iran. And what is happening. So it will be good to have everybody's point on that one.
I don't know that I want. I mean, I'm. All these questions are in my mind. I don't have answers. I mean, it's a very distressing thing for me. I look at the financing that's going to this. I mean, so much Saudi money is going into that, which
media.
In the media,
in the
media.
Okay.
Well, yes,
because
but that's the media is the conduit for all of the coalescing of all of these activities. So that to me is a big thing. I have no doubt that Saudi Arabia is not concerned with human rights in Iran. I have no doubt the US. I mean, the world at large. I mean, but we have interests. I mean, other countries, they have interests. They don't have really, it's not a sense of justice. So I understand that the same way that Iran has and Iranians have, like, because, I mean, I look at the posts and I find it ironic that Iranians say, why is the world silent when these things are happening? People of the world do something, and then I see them silent on other issues. There's always really like a marginal group of people, like a sliver, who talk about you know, what's happening in Yemen or in Bangladesh or Palestine, which is like going on forever. Now, so we're always like, it's a tribal world. We're concerned about what we are going through. But if all of these interests that are not about human rights still kind of come together and get rid of this regime, I will be thankful, of course. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm just looking to see who's playing what role, and I'm trying to look at it, you know, kind of like with a bigger focus, considering Iran is not the only bad actor in the world, not in that same region. I mean, just looking through Amnesty stuff, looking at all the political prisoners in Egypt, you know, so I know that we're not the only bad actors.
Well,
but
we are one of the worst, having said
we are
that,
terrible,
especially towards people, towards the people inside the country, and they haven't been wonderful in the region as well. So one of the worst, I would say. But in relation to the money spent, quite frankly, I'm not concerned about that, because as I wrote to you, I think that it's Iranian agency, the pain is real, and inside the country, it's Iranian agency. At this point, and Iranians, because I had tried with the independent media, without money, you cannot run a quality paper, and the money is not there. Therefore, let Saudis tell the story. As long as they tell the truth, that's good enough. And I think the focus right now should be on removing the regime. So just uniting and ignoring differences, and you know.
Yeah, I'm just not a big fan of removal from outside forces. I want this to happen. I mean, I want support and encouragement, all of that, but I want it to be organic. I'm like always with, but I found one ironic thing about Saudi Arabia. Apparently, they are kind of removing the hijab mandate in Saudi Arabia, which I found very interesting. Kind of like to the point that maybe rapprochement with a regime works better than isolation. I mean, most research says sanctions are counterproductive anyway. So that it's good to have that in mind. It's like, oh, ironic, in Saudi Arabia, they're getting rid of the hijab mandate. Okay. That's good for them. I'm happy for them. I'm happy for them. So
yeah, they're modernizing. He is, despite all his faults, he's trying to modernize, and at least in one level, it's good. Greg is laughing. Greg, what are you laughing about?
Not laughing.
Saudi?
Not laughing. I just
Nobody's fan of Saudi
I hadn't thought
anyway.
much about the Saudi angle, which is interesting. So no, but they're actually providing money to the protesters, are they, or to the?
No. Not the
media.
protesters.
The media.
There is a media, there's Iran International, which is supported, but it's actually Saudi's money running. That's a big TV channel. And
I think
a lot of
news.
Well. Yeah, a lot of them actually.
A lot of them.
Yeah, but Iran International is the main one. So the money comes from Saudi, but they are constructing the narrative. But the narrative is true stories from inside Iran. So I take refuge on that it's true and it's coming from there. So let Saudis spend money for us to have our country back.
What about,
I will be happy.
Has anyone heard anything about the Israeli position at this point, or what their involvement is? I mean, they've been a bit distracted with yet another election, and frankly, I think they're going in the other direction, that there will be hijabs that people will be wearing, or at least the equivalent in Israel, if things keep going towards the right as they have been. But I mean, you know, I haven't seen, have there been any official statements coming out of Israel or anything unofficial that you have?
I think they're very careful. They know how radioactive they are, and so I think they're very, but I have no doubts that, like, behind the scenes, they are also gunning for this. And they said, but I just thought Bibi, like a Halloween special, Bibi is back. Wow.
Yeah, actually, there is a expectation that he may attack or become very aggressive with Iran. It was so far busy trying to be elected. Now that he's back, the predictions is that he's going to announce something or do something, and we will see. But yeah, today with Saudi are in the same boat when it comes to Iran.
Yes.
Yeah.
Anyway, so anything anybody wants to add?
Fingers crossed.
Yes, fingers crossed. Well, thank you, everybody. And we won't have a meeting next week. For the next meeting, please wait for my email, and then on those bases we will have, because I'm traveling extensively. So when I know exactly when I will be available, we will have next meeting. Meanwhile, have a wonderful week or weeks ahead, and see you soon. Take care.
Take care.
Thank
Safe
you.
travel.
Very
Take care.
much.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you so
Bye.
much.